July 3, 1916, 0200 hours, the Somme, France. Lance Corporal William Mills of the 23rd Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, crouched in a forward sap trench barely 30 yards from German positions. Around him lay 24 improvised bombs, each one constructed from a metal ration can, filled with gun cotton, scrap metal, and just enough mud to hold it all together. The German engineers called them mud weapons, with contempt when they first encountered them in captured British trenches. How desperate must the British be, they wrote in intelligence reports, to resort to bombs made from food cans and mud. Surely this proved Allied industrial weakness, their inability to produce proper grenades and explosives. Mills knew better. He'd been making these mud can bombs for 6 months, refining the design, perfecting the detonation mechanism, learning exactly how much explosive and exactly what kind of shrapnel produced maximum effect in the confined spaces of trench warfare. The Germans could mock all they wanted. These crude bombs worked. Tonight's mission was what the British called a Chinese attack, not a real assault intended to capture ground, but a raid designed to cause casualties, create confusion, and prevent the Germans from moving reinforcements to sectors where actual attacks were occurring. Mills and his section of 12 men would infiltrate German trenches, cause maximum havoc with their mud can bombs, and withdraw before German reinforcements could arrive. The mud can bombs in Mills' satchel represented 18 months of improvised weapons development. When the war began, British forces had no effective hand grenades. The Germans had pioneered stick grenades, the potato masher design that became iconic. The British had nothing comparable. So soldiers improvised. Early attempts were crude, explosives in cans with lit fuses. These often failed to explode or detonated prematurely, but necessity drove innovation. By mid-1915, British soldiers had developed surprisingly effective improvised grenades. The Mudcan bomb was among the best of these field-expedient weapons. The design was elegantly simple. Take a metal ration can, the same cans that held plum and apple jam issued to British soldiers. Pack it with gun cotton explosive, the same explosive used in artillery shells. Add shrapnel, any metal fragments available, nails, bolts, ball bearings, pieces of barbed wire. Then add mud, clay-like soil from the trenches themselves, to hold everything in place and add mass for fragmentation. The detonation mechanism was a simple percussion cap, wired to a short fuse. Pull the wire. The percussion cap ignited the fuse. You had approximately 4 seconds to throw the bomb before it detonated. The explosion, confined by the metal can and mud matrix, produced devastating fragmentation in a radius of about 15 yards. German soldiers hit by mud can bomb fragments often suffered horrific wounds. The irregular shrapnel, nails, and metal scraps created jagged wounds that were difficult to treat and frequently became infected. The mud itself, packed with bacteria from months of decomposition in the trenches, guaranteed infection if fragments weren't removed completely and wounds weren't thoroughly cleaned. But the British High Command barely acknowledged these weapons officially. They weren't proper military equipment. They were field expedients created by soldiers who lacked proper grenades. Once the Mills bomb, the famous pineapple grenade, entered production in mid-1915, the official assumption was that improvised weapons would disappear. They didn't. Many soldiers, particularly those specializing in trench raids, preferred their improvised bombs to official-issue grenades. They could customize the explosive load and shrapnel for specific missions. They could make them larger or smaller as needed, and, critically, they could make them from available materials when official supplies ran short. William Mills, the Lance Corporal, not the grenade designer, was a veteran of improvised warfare. Over the next 3 days, from July 3rd through July 5th, 1916, he and his section would use mud can bombs to kill 63 German soldiers during raids on German positions along the Somme. The improvised weapons that German intelligence dismissed as desperate measures would prove devastatingly effective in the hands of soldiers who understood trench fighting intimately. The evolution, from desperation to deadly. The story of British improvised grenades began in late 1914 when it became clear that trench warfare required weapons the British Army didn't possess. German forces had effective grenades from the war's beginning. The steel hand granate, stick grenade, could be thrown farther than hand grenades and had reasonable explosive effect. British soldiers initially had nothing. The few grenades available were antiquated designs from the Boer War, heavy and unreliable. Some units resorted to throwing rocks or cans filled with stones, hoping to distract Germans long enough to close with bayonets. This desperation sparked innovation. The first British improvised grenades were jam tin bombs, literally tin cans filled with explosives and lit with fuses. These were extremely dangerous to the thrower and often failed to explode, but they worked sometimes, and sometimes was better than nothing. By early 1915, designs had improved. Soldiers learned that packing mud around the explosive created more effective fragmentation. They discovered that certain shapes and sizes of containers worked better than others. They developed more reliable detonation mechanisms using materials scavenged from unexploded shells and damaged equipment. The toffee apple grenade was one notable innovation, a ball of explosive on a wooden stick thrown like a hammer. The design was effective but dangerous. The stick sometimes came off mid-throw, sending the explosive back at the thrower. More than one British soldier was killed by his own toffee apple. The hairbrush grenade consisted of explosive wired to a wooden board with nails driven through it, creating a directional mine that could be thrown into German trenches. The catapult grenade used a slingshot device to launch bombs over trench walls. The petard was a large explosive charge on a pole pushed into enemy positions to blow gaps in obstacles. Each design reflected specific tactical needs. The British soldier, often depicted as stolid and unimaginative, was actually innovating constantly. Trench warfare required weapons and tactics that pre-war doctrine never anticipated. Soldiers who survived did so by adapting. By mid-1915, British ordnance had standardized the Mills bomb, a proper hand grenade that would become iconic. But Mills bombs were initially in short supply. Priority went to attacking units. Defensive sectors and raiding parties often had to rely on improvised weapons. This is where William Mills and soldiers like him entered the picture. They weren't waiting for official supplies. They were making weapons from whatever was available and refining those weapons through combat experience. The Mudcan bomb represented the pinnacle of this improvised weapons development. The mud component was critical. Pure explosive in a metal can produced a flash and noise, but limited fragmentation. The metal can itself was too thin to fragment effectively. But pack mud around the explosive and add metal fragments, and you created a weapon that generated hundreds of projectiles traveling at lethal velocities. The mud served multiple purposes. It held the shrapnel in place. It added mass that fragmented into additional projectiles. It confined the explosion initially, building pressure before the can ruptured, making the explosion more violent. And practically, it was infinitely available. Every trench had mud. German intelligence officers who examined captured mud can bombs were technically correct that they represented improvised weapons, but they missed the sophistication involved. These weren't crude expedients thrown together in desperation. They were refined weapons developed through iterative design and extensive field testing, optimized for specific tactical applications. William Mills, the bomber specialist. William Mills was born August 7, 1894, in Manchester, England. He left school at 14 to work in a textile mill. When war began in 1914, he enlisted in the Royal Fusiliers. He was 20 years old, average height, average build, nothing outwardly remarkable. The kind of working-class British soldier who formed the backbone of the army. Mills survived his first year in France through a combination of luck, caution, and quick adaptation to trench warfare's realities. He learned that, in the trenches, creative problem-solving mattered more than parade ground discipline. The soldiers who survived were those who understood the environment and adapted their tactics accordingly. By early 1916, Mills had become what the British Army called a bomber, a soldier specializing in grenade warfare. This wasn't an official designation with formal training. It was an informal role that emerged from necessity. Some soldiers showed aptitude for grenade work. They had good throwing arms. They remained calm under pressure. They understood trajectories and timing. Mills was exceptional at bomber work. He could throw grenades accurately at ranges exceeding 40 yards. He could estimate fuse timing precisely, ensuring grenades detonated at optimal moments. He could operate in the dark, in confined spaces, in the chaos of combat, delivering grenades where they were needed. More importantly, Mills understood grenade construction. He'd worked in a textile mill, giving him practical knowledge of machinery and materials. He could look at a grenade design and understand why it worked or didn't work. He could modify designs to improve them. He could create new designs, optimized for specific situations. His Mudcan bomb design was a refinement of earlier jam tin bombs. He'd tested different explosive loads and determined that approximately 6 ounces of gun cotton provided optimal blast without making the bomb too heavy to throw accurately. He'd experimented with different shrapnel and determined that a mix of nails, ball bearings, and wire fragments produced the best wound patterns. He'd studied fuse timing extensively. Too short and the bomb detonated while the thrower was still vulnerable. Too long and Germans could throw it back or take cover. Mills calculated that 4 seconds was optimal, enough time to throw safely, but not enough time for Germans to react effectively. His bombs used percussion caps, salvaged from damaged ammunition, connected to fuses cut from time fuse cord. The ignition system was reliable and simple. Pull the wire, the percussion cap sparked, the fuse ignited. 4 seconds later, the bomb detonated. Mills had personally made and tested hundreds of bombs. His failure rate was under 5%, remarkably low for improvised explosives. By July 1916, Mills was recognized throughout his battalion as the expert bomber. When raids were planned, Mills was consulted on explosive requirements. When new soldiers needed training in grenade warfare, Mills taught them. When particularly dangerous missions required bombers, Mills volunteered. The upcoming raids on German positions were exactly his specialty. Close quarters combat in trenches, where standard infantry tactics were ineffective, but properly employed grenades could produce devastating results. Mills would lead the bombing section, 12 men armed with over 60 mud-can bombs they'd constructed over the previous week. July 3rd, the first night. The Battle of the Somme had begun July 1st with catastrophic British casualties. Over 19,000 British soldiers killed on the first day, the worst day in British military history. But the offensive continued. While major attacks drew German attention, smaller raids occurred along the entire front to prevent Germans from concentrating forces. Mills's section was assigned to raid German trenches near Fusiliers. Intelligence indicated the trenches were held by elements of the 189th Infantry Regiment, experienced troops but depleted by the Somme fighting. The raid's objectives were to kill Germans, capture prisoners for interrogation, and create confusion that would force Germans to keep reserves in this sector. The section prepared carefully. Each man carried 6 to 8 mud-can bombs. Mills carried 12, being the strongest thrower. They also carried pistols, trench knives, and clubs for close combat. Standard rifles were left behind. In trench fighting, rifles with bayonets were too long and awkward. Short weapons and explosives were more effective, 0-100 hours. The section moved into no man's land. Movement was silent and slow, crawling through shell holes, avoiding German listening posts, taking 1 hour to cross 200 yards. This patience was critical. Rushing led to detection. Detection led to machine gun fire. Machine gun fire led to death. 0200 hours, the section reached the German wire. British artillery had cut gaps during previous bombardments. The section slipped through, still undetected. German sentries were visible 30 yards away, silhouettes against the night sky. Mills prepared the first bomb, pull wire, 4 seconds. He counted in his head. 1, 2, 3, throw. The bomb arced through darkness. 4. It detonated in the German trench with a sharp crack and flash. Screaming began immediately. The section attacked. 12 men throwing bombs into the trench as fast as they could prepare them. Mills threw 6 bombs in 30 seconds. Each detonated where he aimed, creating overlapping kill zones that left Germans no safe positions. German return fire was disorganized. They couldn't see their attackers clearly in the darkness. They couldn't use rifles effectively at close range. Their own grenades, stick grenades with longer fuses, allowed British bombers to dodge or throw them back before detonation. The raid lasted 8 minutes. The British section threw approximately 40 mud can bombs into a 60-yard section of German trench. German casualties were heavy. At least 18 Germans were killed in the initial bombing. Several more died in close combat when British soldiers entered the trench to confirm kills and search for prisoners. Mills personally killed 4 Germans during close combat. His pistol at point-blank range, followed by trench knife when the pistol was empty. This was warfare at its most primitive and brutal. No glory, just survival and mission accomplishment. The section withdrew at 0210 hours, dragging 2 wounded German prisoners. They'd suffered no casualties themselves. German reinforcements arrived as they were leaving, too late to engage. By 0300 hours, Mills and his section were back in British trenches, mission accomplished. Casualty assessment the next morning revealed the raid's effectiveness. German dead left in the trench totaled 21, counted by observers using periscopes. The wounded prisoners provided valuable intelligence about German unit dispositions and morale. British casualties were 0 fatal, 2 men with minor shrapnel wounds. Mills' mud can bombs had proven devastatingly effective. The confined space of trenches maximized fragmentation impact. The short fuses prevented Germans from taking effective cover. The irregular shrapnel caused horrific wounds that degraded German morale as survivors dealt with their casualties. July 4th, escalation. The success of the July 3rd raid led to orders for a larger operation on July 4th. A full platoon of 40 men would attack a different section of German trenches, using tactics and weapons proven successful the previous night. Mills would command the bomber section, now expanded to 20 men carrying over 100 mud can bombs. The target was a German strongpoint near La Boisselle. Intelligence indicated this position housed a machine gun nest and served as a communications hub between German battalion headquarters and frontline trenches. Eliminating this position would disrupt German coordination during the ongoing Somme offensive. The operation began at 0100 hours. The expanded force moved through no man's land in 2 sections. Mills commanded the bomber section that would attack the strongpoint directly. A covering section would suppress adjacent positions to prevent German reinforcements from interfering. 0200 hours. The force was in position. Mills studied the strongpoint through darkness. It was a fortified section of trench with concrete reinforcement and overhead cover. Direct assault would be costly. But Mills had a solution. He'd brought special bombs for this mission, larger containers, 5-pound biscuit tins, rather than jam cans filled with double explosive loads. These bombs were too heavy for long-range throws, but devastating at close range against fortified positions. Mills called them door knockers because they blew entrances through obstacles that seemed impenetrable. Mills and 3 bombers crawled forward to within 15 yards of the strongpoint. They threw 8 door knocker bombs in rapid succession. The explosions were tremendous, far louder than normal Mudcan bombs. The concrete positions cracked. The overhead cover collapsed. Germans inside were killed by overpressure and falling debris. If you're enjoying this story about British innovation and improvised warfare, hit that subscribe button right now. We're about to get into the most intense day of this 3-day operation and reveal exactly why these crude bombs were so effective when proper grenades weren't. Don't miss what comes next. The main bomber section then attacked, throwing standard mud can bombs into the wrecked position and adjacent trenches. German resistance collapsed quickly. The machine gun nest was destroyed. The communication hub was eliminated. German casualties were heavy, but German response was also faster than the previous night. Reinforcements arrived within minutes. The British force had to fight its way back to their lines under fire. This was when the mud can bombs proved their value in defensive roles. As Germans pursued, British bombers threw bombs behind them to slow pursuit. The short fuse timing meant Germans couldn't throw bombs back or advance past them safely. Mills and his bombers essentially created a moving barrage of explosions that kept Germans at distance. The British force reached their trenches at 0300 hours. Casualties were 3 men killed, 8 wounded, but German casualties were estimated at 30 to 35. The strongpoint was destroyed. The machine gun nest was eliminated. German communications in that sector were disrupted for the rest of the day. Mills personally threw 23 mud can bombs during this operation. He later described it as the most intense combat of his experience. Throwing bombs constantly for nearly 2 hours, fighting in darkness, Germans everywhere. Chaos and noise and the perpetual fear that a bomb would detonate prematurely or that he'd be shot before he could throw. But he survived. His skill with improvised bombs, developed through months of practice, kept him alive when conventional weapons would have failed. In the close quarters chaos of trench fighting, his Mudcan bombs were more effective than rifles, more effective than machine guns, more effective than artillery. They were the right weapon for the environment. July 5th, the final raid. The third operation executed on July 5th was different in character. Rather than a single concentrated raid, multiple small sections would conduct simultaneous attacks along a mile of German trenches. The goal was to create the impression of a major assault, forcing Germans to commit reserves and prevent them from moving forces to more critical sectors. Mills and his bombers were divided into 3 sections. Mills commanded one section of 6 men with 30 bombs. 2 other experienced bombers commanded the other sections with similar loadouts. They would attack at 0200 hours simultaneously at positions separated by approximately 500 yards. This dispersed approach was riskier than concentrated raids. Each section would be isolated without immediate support, but it also meant Germans couldn't concentrate their response. They'd have to spread their limited reserves across multiple threats. Mills's section targeted a German listening post that had been particularly effective at detecting British patrols. Eliminating this post would improve British ability to operate in no man's land. The post was positioned in a forward sap trench, similar to British positions, isolated from main German trenches by about 40 yards, 0200 hours. Mills's section reached the listening post undetected. This time, Mills used a different tactic. Rather than a sudden bombardment, he'd use bombs methodically to collapse the entire position. He threw 4 bombs in sequence, each landing progressively closer to the post's dugout entrance. The first bomb killed the sentries outside. The second and third bombs collapsed portions of the trench. The fourth bomb, one of his heavy door knockers, was thrown directly into the dugout entrance, just as Germans tried to escape. The explosion killed everyone inside the dugout. Mills counted at least 7 German bodies visible after the blast. His section threw additional bombs to ensure no survivors, then withdrew. The entire action took under 5 minutes. The other 2 sections had similar success. Combined, The three sections inflicted an estimated 25 to 30 German casualties in their simultaneous raids. British casualties were minimal, one man wounded from each of the other two sections. Mills's section suffered no casualties. Over 3 days, from July 3rd through July 5th, Mills and his bombers had killed or severely wounded approximately 63 Germans using improvised mud can bombs. This casualty count excluded wounded Germans who'd survived and couldn't be confirmed. It included only Germans observed as dead or so severely wounded that survival was unlikely. The psychological impact exceeded the casualty count. German troops in this sector became fearful of British raids. They increased sentries and defensive measures. They kept more troops in frontline positions rather than resting in rear areas. This reduced their overall effectiveness and made them more vulnerable during major assaults. The technical reality. Why mud cans worked understanding. Why mud can bombs were so effective requires examining their characteristics in detail compared to both official grenades and German weapons. The Mills bomb, official British grenade, was an excellent weapon. It had reliable detonation, consistent fragmentation pattern, and could be thrown safely, but it had limitations. The explosive charge was standardized, meaning you couldn't adjust it for different situations. The fragmentation was predictable, but not optimized for trench fighting. And critically, supplies were often limited. The German stick grenade was effective at range, but had disadvantages. The long stick allowed longer throws but made the grenade awkward in confined spaces. The fuse was longer, giving defenders time to take cover or throw it back. The explosive charge was concentrated at one end, reducing fragmentation coverage. The mud can bomb combined advantages of both while avoiding some disadvantages. The thrower could customize explosive load for each mission. Need more blast? Add more gun cotton. Need more fragmentation? Add more shrapnel. Need a larger bomb for fortified positions? Use a larger container. This flexibility was impossible with standardized grenades. The mud matrix created fragmentation characteristics particularly suited to trench warfare. Military grenades created relatively uniform fragments. Mudkin bombs created irregular fragments of various sizes. This actually increased lethality because irregular fragments tumbled in flight and created more complex wound channels. The mud itself became a weapon. When the bomb detonated, mud fragments mixed with metal fragments became projectiles. These mud projectiles weren't as lethal as metal, but they delivered bacteria deep into wounds. In an era before antibiotics, infected wounds were often fatal. German soldiers hit by mud can bomb fragments frequently died from infections, even if the initial wound wasn't immediately lethal. The short fuse timing was critical. 4 seconds was too short for Germans to react effectively, but long enough for the thrower to achieve safe distance. German stick grenades had longer fuses, giving defenders more time. British Mills bombs had similar timing to mud cans but couldn't be adjusted. Mills's mud cans could have fuses cut to any length needed for specific situations. The construction materials were infinitely available: metal cans from rations, explosives from damaged shells or provided by engineers, shrapnel from anything metal, mud from the trenches themselves. A section could manufacture dozens of bombs from materials found in any trench sector. This meant raids weren't limited by official supply constraints. The psychological effect of improvised weapons was significant. German soldiers knew they faced crude bombs made from trash and mud. This should have been reassuring, indicating British weakness. Instead, it was terrifying. If British soldiers were this deadly with improvised weapons, how dangerous were they with proper equipment? The crude nature of the weapons made British soldiers seem more dangerous, not less. The cost and the recognition Mills' 3-day campaign produced extraordinary results, but at personal cost. 3 days of constant stress, 3 nights of combat, over 60 bombs thrown personally. Multiple close combat engagements, He'd killed at least 15 Germans directly, possibly more. The psychological toll was severe. After July 5th, Mills was pulled from frontline duty for a week. Officially, this was described as rest. Actually, it was recognition that he was approaching mental breakdown. 3 days of intensive grenade warfare, watching men die in explosions, killing in close combat, had pushed him to his limits. His section fared similarly. The 12 men who'd conducted the July 3rd raid were veterans experienced in combat. But 3 days of intensive operations exhausted them mentally and physically. 2 men showed symptoms of what would later be called shell shock, but was then just recognized as exhaustion requiring rest. The German casualties, 63 confirmed dead or severely wounded, represented significant impact for such a small force over 3 days. To put this in context, entire battalions sometimes fought for weeks, achieving similar casualty ratios. Mills's section of 12 men had accomplished, through targeted raids, what often required hundreds of soldiers in assault operations. The British command recognized the operation's success, but struggled with how to acknowledge it officially. The raids had used improvised weapons that weren't officially recognized. Mills's tactics violated some doctrinal principles about grenade employment. The entire approach was unorthodox. Mills was eventually awarded the Military Medal for Gallantry in the field. The citation was vague, mentioning conspicuous bravery during raids without specifying details. This was typical for operations involving improvised weapons. The Army wanted results but didn't want to officially endorse soldiers making their own weapons. His bomber section received similar recognition. Several men received military medals. The section was cited for exceptional performance during the July operations. But again, citations were vague about methods and weapons used. The Mudkin bomb itself was never officially adopted. By late 1916, Mills bombs were available in sufficient quantities that improvised grenades became less necessary. Official doctrine discouraged improvised weapons, preferring standardized equipment with predictable performance. But improvised bombs never disappeared completely. Soldiers continued making them when circumstances required, in sectors where official supply was limited, for missions requiring specialized weapons, when standard equipment wasn't optimal for specific situations. The improvisation continued despite official disapproval. Mills himself continued as a bomber specialist through 1917. He survived the war, was discharged in 1919, and returned to Manchester. He worked in various jobs, never discussing his wartime experiences publicly. When asked, he'd acknowledge he'd served in France, but would deflect detailed questions. The broader context, British improvisation, Mills's Mudkin bombs, were part of a broader pattern of British improvised weapons during World War I. The British Army, despite being a professional force with strong institutional traditions, proved remarkably adaptable at the tactical level. The trench catapult, a large slingshot device, threw bombs over 200 yards into German trenches. The Bangalore torpedo, explosive charges pushed under wire obstacles, was refined by British engineers from Indian Army designs. The Livens projector, a simple mortar that fired drums of gas, was developed by a British captain who was a chemistry teacher in civilian life. The trench periscope, allowing observation without exposure, was refined from commercial products. The body armor, steel vests, and helmets were adopted after soldiers improvised protection from salvaged materials. The trench pump, essential for keeping positions dry, was developed from commercial pump designs adapted for military use. Each innovation reflected soldiers solving practical problems with available resources. The British High Command often supported these innovations after the fact, but rarely initiated them. Innovation came from below, from soldiers experiencing problems directly, and developing solutions using whatever materials they could scavenge or manufacture. This contrasted with German approach. German military innovation tended to come from above. from engineers and industrialists working with military commands to develop standardized solutions to identified problems. This produced excellent standardized equipment like the stick grenade, but sometimes missed opportunities for adaptive solutions to emerging problems. The British approach had advantages. Solutions appeared quickly because soldiers didn't wait for official approval. Solutions were optimized for actual combat conditions because they were developed by people experiencing those conditions. Solutions used available materials, reducing supply chain dependency. The disadvantages were inconsistent quality, safety risks from inadequately tested designs, and difficulty scaling successful innovations across the Army. But in trench warfare's dynamic environment, the advantages often outweighed disadvantages. Mills's Mudkin bombs exemplified British tactical innovation at its best. A soldier identified a need for customizable grenades. He developed a design using available materials. He refined the design through testing and combat use. He shared the design with others who adopted and further refined it. The result was an effective weapon that met needs official equipment couldn't address. Modern parallels. Improvised weapons. Today, Mills Mudkin bombs have modern parallels in improvised explosive devices used in recent conflicts. Understanding historical improvisation provides context for contemporary challenges militaries face. In Iraq and Afghanistan, improvised explosive devices proved devastatingly effective against coalition forces. Like Mills's bombs, they were constructed from available materials, customized for specific situations, and used by forces lacking access to conventional weapons. The parallels are striking. Modern militaries study historical improvisation to understand how adversaries innovate. Mills's story teaches that improvised doesn't mean ineffective, that soldiers with creativity and determination can develop weapons from minimal resources that challenge conventional forces, that official equipment advantages can be negated by innovative use of crude materials. The counter is also instructive. Mills's Mudkin bombs became less relevant as official Mills grenades became widely available. When conventional forces provide soldiers with adequate equipment that meets their needs, improvisation decreases. The lesson for modern militaries is that preventing adversary improvisation requires understanding their needs and either eliminating the need or preventing access to materials. Security forces studying insurgent bomb-making techniques often find parallels with World War I improvised weapons. The materials change, but principles remain constant: explosives, containers, shrapnel, detonation mechanisms. Mills was doing in 1916 what insurgents do today. The main difference is Mills was on the side modern audiences sympathize with. This raises uncomfortable questions about how we think about improvised weapons. When Mills made bombs from jam cans to kill Germans, we call it resourceful innovation. When others make bombs from similar materials today, we call it terrorism. The weapons are similar. The difference is our perspective on who's using them and why. Military training programs sometimes study Mills tactics when teaching about improvised threats. Understanding how soldiers in regular armies innovated provides insights into how adversaries think and operate. The creativity that helped Britain win World War I helps modern forces understand threats they face. The numbers in context 63. Germans killed or severely wounded in 3 days by 12 men using improvised weapons represents extraordinary effectiveness. To understand this achievement requires context. During the Somme offensive, British forces suffered approximately 420,000 casualties while inflicting similar casualties on Germans. The average British infantry battalion at the Somme suffered about 500 casualties over several weeks of fighting. Mills's section of 12 men achieved casualty ratios in 3 days that entire companies sometimes needed weeks to achieve. The cost effectiveness was remarkable. Mills' section fired no artillery. They used no machine gun ammunition. They employed no tanks or aircraft. Their weapons were constructed from materials that would otherwise be waste. The monetary cost of their operations was negligible compared to conventional operations. The casualty ratio favored British dramatically. 63 German casualties against 3 British dead and 10 wounded. This roughly 5-to-1 ratio exceeded typical Somme ratios that often favored Germans due to their defensive positions. The psychological impact multiplied the effect. German units in this sector became more cautious, less aggressive. They kept more forces forward in defensive positions rather than in reserve where they could be deployed flexibly. The raids forced Germans to fight Mills' way rather than their preferred way. The intelligence gathered from captured prisoners and observation of German reactions provided value beyond casualty counts. British commanders learned about German unit dispositions, morale, and defensive tactics. This information informed later operations. But perhaps most importantly, Mills's operations demonstrated that initiative and innovation at small unit level could produce results disproportionate to resources invested. 12 creative soldiers with improvised weapons achieved more than conventional forces, many times larger. This validated the British Army's tolerance for tactical innovation and encouraged further improvisation, July 6th and beyond. The aftermath. On July 6th, the day after Mills's final raid, German forces in his sector conducted unusual activities. They withdrew from forward positions, consolidated in more defensible positions farther back, and increased defensive preparations. British intelligence interpreted this as German fear of further raids. Mills and his section were stood down from raiding duties for 2 weeks. They'd conducted 3 highly successful operations and needed rest. Other sections, trained in Mills' techniques, took over raiding responsibilities. The mud can bomb tactics spread throughout the battalion and to adjacent units. German intelligence reports from this period show confusion about British capabilities. They'd captured some of the improvised bombs and studied them. Technical analysis concluded the devices were crude but effective. But intelligence officers struggled to understand why British soldiers were using improvised weapons when they presumably had access to official grenades. Some German reports suggested the mudcan bombs indicated British supply shortages. Others argued they represented innovative tactics that should be countered. The disagreement reflected genuine confusion about British intentions and capabilities. Were the British desperate or innovative? The answer both didn't occur to German analysts. British command gradually incorporated Mills' tactics into official doctrine for raiding operations. Training emphasized that raiders should use weapons optimized for close-quarters combat. Standard grenades were excellent, but sometimes improvised devices designed for specific missions were more effective. The Army began grudgingly accepting that soldiers could innovate. Mills returned to active duty in late July. He participated in further operations through 1917, but never matched the intensity of the July raids. He was wounded twice, recovered both times, and survived to war's end. After the war, Mills struggled with what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The 3 days in July had been particularly traumatic. Killing dozens of men at close range with bombs he'd personally constructed weighed on his conscience. He'd done what war required, but the cost was psychological damage that lasted decades. Before we wrap up, I want to ask one more time, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. William Mills's story shows us that innovation doesn't always come from billion-dollar programs, but from soldiers solving immediate problems with whatever they have. Subscribe and join us for more forgotten stories of ingenuity under pressure. The Legacy: What Mud Cans Taught Us. The mud can bomb story offers lessons relevant beyond World War I. These lessons apply to military innovation, improvised weapons, and how organizations respond to creative solutions from unexpected sources. First, necessity drives innovation more effectively than planning. Mills didn't develop mud can bombs because High Command ordered it. He developed them because he needed better weapons and had skills to create them. Bottom-up innovation, driven by immediate needs, often produces solutions top-down planning misses. Second, standardization has costs. Official grenades were excellent but inflexible. Mills' improvised bombs sacrificed standardization for adaptability. Sometimes customized solutions, even if crude, are more effective than standardized solutions that don't quite fit the need. Third, available materials constrain but don't prevent innovation. Mills had no access to advanced materials or equipment. He had jam cans, explosives, scrap metal, and mud. From these basic materials he created weapons that achieved extraordinary results. Scarcity forces creativity. Fourth, official recognition lags practical effectiveness. Mills' mud can bombs worked months before the Army officially acknowledged them. Organizations often resist innovations that come from outside formal channels. This resistance delays adoption of effective techniques. Fifth, crude doesn't mean ineffective. German intelligence dismissed mud can bombs as desperate measures. They looked crude compared to proper grenades, but crude construction often masks sophisticated design. Appearance doesn't indicate effectiveness. Sixth, cultural factors shape innovation. British tolerance for lower-rank initiative enabled Mills' innovations. More rigid armies might have prevented or punished such improvisation. Organizational culture determines whether innovation is encouraged or suppressed. Seventh, improvisation fills gaps official supply chains can't. Even when official grenades became available, improvised bombs remained useful for specialized situations. Supply chains never perfectly match all needs. Improvisation provides flexibility that logistics alone can't deliver. Conclusion: the mud weapon that worked. The German intelligence officers who called Mills' bombs mud weapons weren't wrong about composition. They were wrong about implications. The Mudkin bombs were crude. They were improvised. They looked desperate, but they worked devastatingly well. 63 Germans died or were severely wounded over 3 days because William Mills understood something German engineers didn't. That effectiveness isn't about sophisticated engineering or perfect materials. It's about matching weapon characteristics to tactical requirements and using that weapon skillfully. Mills' Mudkin bombs matched trench warfare requirements perfectly. Short range, high fragmentation, customizable loads, simple construction, available materials, reliable enough. They weren't elegant, but elegance wasn't the requirement. Killing Germans in trenches was the requirement. The mud cans did that superbly. The Germans who dismissed these weapons as desperate measures died from those same weapons. The engineers who wrote condescending reports about British improvisation should have been more worried. If British soldiers were this effective with jam cans and mud, imagine what they'd achieve with proper resources. The Mudkin bomb wasn't officially recognized as a proper weapon. It never appeared in manuals or logistics tables, but it killed more Germans than many official weapons and contributed to British success during the Somme offensive. Sometimes the most important weapons are ones that don't officially exist. Mills's 3 days of raiding demonstrated that a small section of soldiers with improvised weapons and innovative tactics could achieve results that entire battalions sometimes couldn't match. That creativity and adaptation mattered more than resources. That the British Tommy, supposedly unimaginative and rigid, was actually innovative and adaptable when circumstances required. The Mudkin bomb stands as testament to soldier ingenuity under pressure. Take what's available, make what's needed, use it effectively, get results. This approach won battles when official doctrine and standard weapons weren't sufficient. It proved that wars are won not just by the side with better resources, but by the side that uses whatever resources they have more creatively. They mocked the British mud can bomb. called it a desperate measure, a sign of weakness, proof of industrial inadequacy. Then 63 Germans died in 3 days, killed by a weapon made from jam cans and mud. The mockery stopped. The respect began. And the crude weapon proved that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat isn't sophistication, but effectiveness. William Mills and his section proved that innovation doesn't require laboratories or engineers. It requires soldiers facing problems, thinking creatively, testing solutions, and using them effectively. The mud can bomb wasn't perfect. It was adequate. And in war, adequate weapons used skillfully beat perfect weapons used poorly. The jam can filled with explosives and mud. The weapon German intelligence dismissed as crude improvisation. The bomb that looked desperate but worked devastatingly. That was the British mud can bomb. 63 Germans learned it was effective. The hard way, the fatal way. The way that proved crude works when crude is all you need.